Good day, grade 12 learners, and welcome to our video today where I'm going to be talking about the IPO model, or the model of questions where they give you a scenario and they're asking you to detail the IPO. In other words, remember our information processing cycle from grade 10, right? Input, processing, storage, output. So they can give you a scenario like I've got here and then ask you some questions based on that. So here we had a scenario, just as an example of Eskom, since it's very relevant. It supplies 95% of the electricity to the country. They talk a bit about load shedding, etc., etc. So they give you a nice scenario, right? Then they ask you a couple of questions. Look at this. What data does Eskom need from the power stations that produce electricity to be inputted into their load shedding program, right? What data will Eskom need from municipalities? How will they process this data, etc.? Okay, so these are just a couple of questions. Now, have a look at this, because this is a typical type of question that can be asked in an exam or in real life circumstances. After reading the scenario, they want you to develop an algorithm to solve the problem and categorize the tasks according to, here we go, input, processing. Don't worry about storage so much. It's usually just input, processing, and output. So again, you read the scenario, they ask you to do that, and then they'll usually indicate on the question paper or on the answer sheet, they'll have the steps, like they'll have input, they'll have processing, they'll have output, and then you need to indicate that. So here's an example, because they want you to develop an algorithm. So you should know by now what an algorithm is, that it's working from one point to the other to solve a particular problem. So where does it start? How does it go from step 1 to step 2 all the way to the end? Okay. They say here, I'm going to read it again. You need to develop an algorithm to solve the problem and categorize the tasks according to input, processing, storage, and output. So let's have a look at the answer. So step 1. The power production from the power stations and the power requirements from the municipalities need to be entered, that's input, and stored permanently, storage. Okay, so you don't have to use the exact same wording when you are dealing with a question like this, but can you see that in step 1, input is the main thing. It's like when I use the example of entering a phone number in your cell phone. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to type in your phone. Okay, so whatever data they need from these power stations, that needs to be entered onto the system and stored permanently. So that's already dealing with your input over there. Then I want to go down to step 3. Okay, well, let's look at step 2. Once Eskom's received input from the many power stations, the possible power produced from all the power stations need to be totaled, and likewise the power requirements of all municipalities must be totaled. Okay, so that's done. Step 3. These two values, the ones that they mentioned here, need to be compared. If the total power generated is equal to or more than the total power required, then there will be no load shedding. Alternatively, if the power generated is less than the total required, then the underproduction amount will need to be calculated. Can you see anything to do with those calculations, etc.? That's going to be dealing with processing. So if you take it with the example of your cell phone, the fact that your cell phone is now searching through its memory to see if you already have that number saved, that is the processing. The storage is obviously where we save it, and the output is when we have a look at everything, or when we look at that number. So here in step 4, this shortfall needs to be stored and compared to the load shedding table to determine the load shedding level. The processing must be implemented and sent to municipalities. That's output. And then the load shedding level must be permanently stored. So I know this is a bit tricky as an example, but this is just to show you how these questions can be asked. So go through a few examples, a few scenarios. Maybe I looked at the June papers, but I didn't really see anything. But I know it does come up every now and then. And it usually comes up also in your September papers in the end of the year. But just so you are ahead of the curve, always make sure that you prepare yourself for IPO model questions.